Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti federalists, they got it right. But as we continue to read through what is going on with those states' conventions, we want to constantly go back and understand that foundationally, the way that the Constitution should operate is how the states determined through their conventions that the Constitution should work. And now the states are caught up in what the Anti Federalists did predict, that the federal government would and could subsume the states through all of the misinterpretations, misguidance, um, all the frustrations that have happened over the last, oh, I don't know, couple hundred years, I guess we could say. And yes, this is Tom Navolis, your host, and I'm so delighted that you are here. And this week we are going to go down an interesting path. It's been one of those weeks that, as I finished up the constitutional classes for the week, I had to start thinking through in vain, I guess, or in view of this program, uh, what happened that is critical for us to understand our present time. And for those that need to be called out and reminded of what is true, I had to look at this program from that perspective in a video blog that Doug Wilson did on sheepdogs, and he is more biblically correct and sound in his thinking on how he calls out the evangelical leaders, because that was what happened to the sheepdogs. Also, what happened even deeper. I want to go down that path a bit, but what's the role of a prophet? Tom, what are you doing? You started out this whole thing talking about Constitution, and we're looking at uh, the conventions, the ratifying conventions of the states in relationship to how the Constitution should be interpreted. Well, what's important to understand is what Madison and John Adams said in particular, that what this Constitution is for a moral and virtuous, or a moral and religious people. I'm going to put the big parentheses. You on the radio can't see this, but I'm doing the quotes with quotes here. Only, capital letters, only for those moral, virtuous, religious people, not for anybody else. So I guess when we look at this, I'm terming, I guess, something to the effect, the um, title here is that sheepdogs and prophets, because a prophet, according to some of the literature and the references that you have here to look at in today's podcast and radio program, you can go to the references back on the website at samueladamsreturns.net. And you can see that a prophet isn't someone that just knows the future. That what the prophets in the Old Testament were people that clearly understood the situation at hand and were given those insights by God to, first off, warn the people, and second off, to challenge and call out those that were sinning against God and destroying the people, even in governance. Yeah, that's what it was all about. So I guess when we look at who are the sheepdogs, we hear that a lot from all the different pundits that are out there. Oh, the sheepdog, we got to be sheepdogs. That was even a theme at Liberty Camp here that I've participated in is that we need to be sheepdogs, teaching these kids what it means to be a sheepdog that watches, is watchful, and takes and guides and ensures that the wolves and coyotes do not come and ravage the sheep. But I guess on the ecclesiastical side of things, which we'll touch on in this segment, is the sheepdogs in many instances, including obviously the evangelical churches in particular, became the sheep. And they're the sheep that they're the lead sheep. So half the time, as the lead sheep, what they do is they lead the flock over the cliff. Crazy, I know. But that's where we are, ladies and gentlemen. And that is something that those who were arguing during the debates within the context of the states and ratification were really trying to look at. How do we make sure that people are not led astray? How do we make sure that the Constitution will function as a form of government that also maintains the integrity and the rights of the states and those of the individuals within the states, and that the enumerated powers within the federal government are those which are only executed? So, what happened to the sheepdogs in that regard when we not only look at the churches, but then as we look at what happened in the political bodies? So, I want to go back to a old writing that I kind of talked about before, but I thought it was appropriate to do it now. Is by a guy by the name of C. Greg Singer. And he wrote this book that is called The Unholy Alliance. And I thought that just in the preface, not so much, but a bit, but in the when it gets into the background, especially on the National Council of Churches, which was, I think, the first chapter in the book. Where we are today in trying to understand what is going on with the woke movement, what is going on with the critical race theory, what is going on with Black Lives Matter, what is going on with all of this individual, what we could term as, if you were looking at it from back in the foundation of this nation, they would have called it insanity, is more than that. It's more than insanity. If you looked at the pastors during the foundation, they would have called it just flat out sin. And they would have called it the whole concept that the individual sin, as well as then what was becoming a national sin. And you kind of look at me cross-eyed about that. Well, Tom, how does that work in relationship to, this whole political environment of constitutionalism and that? Well, let's continue to keep at the top, and I guess I'm going to have to write it across the screen of the video at the top, not usually at the bottom or wherever I can put it, even in the middle and obscure myself for those watching the video. What it'll be is that without a moral and virtuous slash religious people, the Constitution degenerates into the opportunity of tyranny and despotism. Now, where does that come into play then in relationship to the National Council of Churches or its early formation from the Federal Council of Churches? Now, these things happened, and this is where I want to kind of do a historical review of where the sheepdogs in the evangelicalism, and we're going to carry it over into the second segment because I just got the high five, is that the sheepdogs in the evangelical world are the missing the boat theologically in so many different ways. But when we look at especially the idea of the social gospel and then the radical gospel that was preached and still is at the likes of Reverend Wright's church and many other churches and denominations, when you look at that, it drives back to those 1800s. It drives back to the 1820s and 1830s. A few programs ago, I talked to you about the Unitarianism coming in, Universalism coming in the late 1700s, mid to late 1700s, right there at Harvard. Well, they still had some sense of biblical truth. But then as we move into the 1820s and 30s, the next thing we know is that, as our friend here in the book that I just mentioned, Singer, takes and he brings out the point that what happened was the idealism of Immanuel Kant, G.W.F. Hegel, English Romanticism really started taking effect, and that we saw even Unitarianism take and make a transition away from the fundamentals to the whole transcendentalism insanity. And it became a philosophy that pushed all the way into the 1860s to the point that then we had the social gospel start to overshadow everything else. And when we see that, we start looking at what was the corruption in American theology that then, as you listen to what I have as the reference to Doug Wilson's blog, video blog, is that the modern evangelicals in the, I'll call them cemeteries, he called them the higher education that a lot of these students, even these intellectual pastors are at or have come out of, missed the boat. They are subject to all of these other, uh, I call them now the perversions, the sins of losing the truth in the gospel. They have become the whole idea of what is going on in this transcendentalism that is now reshaped, reshaped in all of these other movements of individualism and the movement that has happened with the LGBTQ, with Black Lives Matter, with critical race theory. All of this is a menagerie that has developed from what's gone on all the way back into the 1830s. So you have the great hostility against Calvinism that came through these new thoughts, the new school of thought in America. It even happened in Presbyterianism, resulted in a denominational split there between the Reform and that in 1837. Then you had the other theological split that still goes on today between Calvinism and Arminianism and what's going on there. And then you see that even the Congregationalists have gone to the backside of the world. Sam Adams was a Puritan Congregationalist. Many of the foundational pastors were those that held those truths. Now we're going to have to take a look a little bit deeper into this transcendentalism, how it has caused depravity for those that should be the sheepdogs. And I don't mean that they're depraved, but that the theology has left the prophets attacking the enemy the way that they should. And Sam Adams understood that. So come on back for the next segment. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this second segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti federalists, they got it right. And you know what? There was that discussion of what was what during those, what, state conventions. And I want you to take a look at those when you get a chance to. There's a lot of references out there. I'll start feeding you some of that information, but I got a bigger picture and reason for that we'll disclose in due time. But what I want you to remember is that if you're listening to Liberty Works Radio Network on the programming on Saturday, geez, I know that then you're taking and you're going and looking at all those other hosts and hostesses, but mostly you're looking for that donate button, aren't you? I know that. Yes, you are. You're going to look for that donate button because this is a listener funded network, and I really like you to help support and keep this network doing all that it's doing for the purposes and cause of liberty. Now, what I have to jump back to is the idea that this transcendentalism, let me kind of go here, is that you had even the likes of writers, you had likes of politicians and all of that were uh, locked into this. They went down this path that really was all about the where the American individualism really came from, but it became extremely perverted in so many different ways. So let's go to a, oh gosh, just a simple, and yeah, I know I don't always like it, but Wikipedia has this really interesting development on transcendentalism. And it's a philosophical movement that developed in the late 1820s and 30s in the eastern United States. Look, a lot of nonsense started in the eastern United. All the good stuff started in the eastern United States, but then all of the garbage, even the stuff today. I mean, California's bad, but when you start looking at New York and Massachusetts and all of those places that brought this nation to a place of wonder, it's now taking it to a place of perversion and destruction. So, a core belief is that the inherent goodness of people and nature, that's what it's all about. That's the core belief. And while society and its institutions have corrupted the purity of the individual, now are you hearing that in all the wokeism? Are you hearing that echo? That mirror of history right there, 1830, 1820, and you're hearing the woke crowd and BLM and Black Lives Matter and all of these others saying that, oh, the individuals are wonderful in nature, the environmentalist nature is great, but, society and the institutions have corrupted it all. Interesting. Nothing new. People are at their best when truly self reliant. Okay. And independent. So the transcendentalists saw divine experience inherent in the everyday rather than believing in a distinct heaven. The transcendentalists saw physical and spiritual phenomena as part of dynamic processes rather than discrete entities. So when we start looking at what happened with this Constitution, that changes the dynamics of the Constitution, should change with the dynamics of society, it moves away from the absolute discrete entities. And it definitely moves away from our rights being those that are given to us by God. It takes and it destroys what our original conceptual founding document, the Declaration of Independence, clearly states regarding unalienable or inalienable rights. So right there. Now, what it ultimately does is it takes and it emphasizes the fact that each individual is their own God. Oh, I guess that's why each individual can go take and, transgender. Each individual can take and determine that their girls should be boys and their boys should be girls. The collective individual, if you will, in the schools can determine how they want to reconstruct society through the likes of the language changes that come from critical race theory. This is interesting. So, what had happened, and one of the things that, or thing, I like using things, okay, but one of the principal concepts, if you will, if we're going to get into the philosophical statements of it, and and you can follow Doug Wilson better if I don't use things, but I use the principles and concepts. That what you get there is that these intellectualism becomes now the spiritual truism. So I'm going to hold up once again one of my favorite books. I kind of keep it here for all sorts of reasons. Is Intellectuals in Society by Thomas Sowell. Man, I'm talking. Here's Thomas Sowell. In this case, was a prophet. We're going to talk about prophets more in the third segment. But I want you to just grab onto that the doctrines of the Unitarian Church, as taught by the Harvard Divinity School, became the footing for this whole transcendental movement and what went on. We can go through and you can read in here all of the different people that were involved in it. But what I want to drop back to now is something that was in that original book that I was trying to talk to you about by none other than Singer on the Unholy Alliance. What happened from the Federal Council of Churches perspective, and where did that all push down to? Because when you have bad theology and you start moving into the radical theology of the likes of a poet pastor being Ralph Waldo Emerson. A lot of people heard of him, have read. But I mean, this guy was one of the major proponents of transcendentalism. And what happened in that, when you go past and post Civil War period, and you start getting 1865, 1880, is that we see that it set up based on the now independence, but yet defining collectivism and a lot of other components, which are in the resources at samueladamsreturns.net, is that the socialism and communism inherent in abolitionism gained a new footing in America by the mid 1880s. And they were getting wider support, both the uh, dis, oh boy, they were getting wider support in society and in theological liberals were taking and espousing the social gospel. And you have to excuse me for that little blip there because my mouth got rather dry. It's been a long week. So what was happening is that through this social gospel, they were taking and trying to develop this panacea for all social ills. And then when we start moving forward, and now the shifts in American theology, and we start seeing this departure from our core and root faith that and Christianity, now we see that what? Yes, exactly. We see that everything that happens in the theological, political environment shows up where? In the social and political realm. So the changes that we're seeing in this whole effort around the woke movement, folks, that's nothing new. That is a direct derivative from the philosophical movements that had been rooted in this transcendentalism. And quite frankly, there's only one way to summarize it, is that it's, following sin. And anybody that's acknowledging all these different philosophical thoughts, all of these areas of wokeness, if you will, are just, walking the path of, yeah, basic individual, because now we're talking transcendental is all about individualism. So if you're all about individualism, guess what? Biblically, that says that individually we are sinners. But then if you're leading people down the path of sinfulness and you're causing cultural disruption that has anti God perspectives, now you're taking and leading a nation into national cultural sin, perversion. And when you start going down that path, what do? You take and you are legislating morality. And in so many cases, what we're seeing is the legislation of immorality. Now, I could keep going down that path, and you'll see there's the reference and where you can find the link to the Unholy Alliance. I've spoken on that before. But what really ties into this is what I was doing in the constitutional classes this week is what happened to Czechoslovakia and how does that parallel what's going on now? There, you've heard me for the years now, years speaking of a work that is called Not a Shot Fired. And this was Jan Kosak uh, gave us the true facts of what happened in Czechoslovakia, how it was taken over. And I will tell you straight up, it's the parallelisms and the plan. I've talked to you before about the pressure from below and the pressure from above, what happens in education, what happens in media, how the enemy gets elected, timely review. I'm going to start the paragraphs that I want you to pay attention to. We're going to come back in the third segment, talk about it a little bit more, and then we're going to follow up on uh, this idea of prophets and what is it that, anyway, we'll come to that in the third segment. I don't want to jump down that rat hole at the moment, or could be a rabbit hole. So, such a question that is here, we're going to go back. One might ask today, years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, why would anyone want to read a report by a communist about the revolutionary takeover of Czechoslovakia, a country that no longer exists? The Czechs are capitalists now, remember? Such a question reveals a number of erroneous assumptions that this document convincingly refutes, not the least of which is the false assumption that the leaders of the former communist state of Eastern Europe were wedded to an ideology. Pay attention to that. Wedded to an ideology. We keep calling all these Obama and Biden people communists. Many of them are, but are they wedded to the ideology? As Jan Kozak and 40 years of brutal Communist Party rule in Czechoslovakia so clearly demonstrate, communism was a tactic employed for the assumption of power rather than a sincere belief. These same tactics, modified only slightly, are being used today. Americans who labor under the false premise that communism is either an ideology or a system of economics that died with the Cold War do so at their own personal and national peril. Now, I let people know that I know of a church in Northeast Ohio, a megachurch, where the pastor clearly said from the pulpit, communism's dead. Why do you want to get involved in politics? Sam Adams always knew why. And it was so that we would be vigilant, that we would be aware of the sinful natures of man and how they would impact governance. Come on back. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this third segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti federalists, they got it right. It's just arguably how's the way we're supposed to actually function as a constitutional republic. And with that, we also have to understand what is the theological premise upon which a moral and virtuous people are whom the Constitution is intended for. Well, all you folks there at Soaring Eagle Radio, welcome back. And I'm so delighted that you are here. And yes, this is Tom Novolis, your host. And what we were doing as we closed out that second segment was reading from an introduction through the Robert Welsh University on Not a Shot Fired, which was a report done by Jan Kozak, which you've heard me speak about year after year after year after year. And now you're hearing me speak about it again. Now, we'll talk about prophets, and many of them spoke year after year after year after year to the people and the political and religious leaders of their day. Yes. And where they had the future insight was when God gave them that as to what would happen if they didn't what? Repent from their sin. So let's take a look and jump back to this whole idea of what I closed the last segment with is that a well-known pastor in Northeast Ohio took this last sentence, and I'm going to read it for you. Here is that as Jan Kovac, as Jan Kovac, Kozak, and 40 years of brutal Communist Party rule in Czechoslovakia clearly demonstrate communism was a tactic employed for the assumption of power. You see, that's what's going on with the Bidens. That's what's been going on all the way back with Jimmy Carter. That was going on with the Clintons. That was going on with whom? Yes, none other than Franklin Roosevelt. That was going on with Woodrow Wilson. Oh my. Maybe some of it was even going on with Abraham Lincoln. What is the assumption of power rather than a sincere belief? I see that with much of the modern, even the Republican Party. It has nothing to do with what they have sincere belief in relationship to what is conservatism. No. Hey, who are the candidates that are out there that are running? Who are those that are elected? And it is about power. Power. So as I continue, here is that the introduction to Not a Shot Fired. These same tactics, modified only slightly, are being used today. Americans who labor under the false premise that communism is either an ideology or a system of economics that died with the Cold War do so at their own personal and national peril. Most Americans are falsely conditioned to believe today that elective governments are permanently established and particularly invincible to destruction. So long as elections are free from fraud, what happened in 2020? And consumers can buy Big Mac hamburgers in the market. This goes to my whole saying about, who cares about liberty when you have good economy? Wow, what happens when you have fraud in elections? So, this document is a how-to manual for totalitarian takeover of an elected parliamentary system of government through mainly legal and constitutional means. I have for years said, I have prophesied for years, and that means that I did not see into the future. I just read these documents and understood what was happening socially, culturally, politically, to the extent that you can now see today what I have been talking about for a number of years, these methodologies that are employed here in none other than Not a Shot Fired has taken and brought us to where we are today. And that is socialism is everywhere. The bureaucratic elite rule. You have a political class, an oligarchy. Congress is actually meaningless in so many different ways. The states have been subsumed by the federal government. Well, time out. Uh, really? It was the anti federalist in so many ways that were predictive. Okay, they were predictive of what would happen if we did not execute according to the state conventions how we would manage our Constitution and ensure that our rights were sustained. Oh my goodness. So, class last night, we were going through the amendments 11 through 27. And quite frankly, people were appalled as we went through those to clearly understand that many of those amendments did nothing to maintain our fundamental constitutional rights as guaranteed in the Bill of Rights, as well assumed, as Hamilton would write, and as Hamilton would assume, that the Constitution itself secured all of the various rights of we the people to the extent that you really didn't need to amend it a whole lot. Well, I got to say for Hamilton, and that, hopefully true, that he had his Christian beliefs. So, if his Christian beliefs were those of a fundamental Christian, then one could ascertain that the rights would be secured because, as Madison and John Adams clearly said, taking you back once again to what we really were emphasizing in the first two segments, this Constitution is only, only for a moral and virtuous slash religious people, not for anybody else. So that's what we have today. We don't have anybody else. You have very few that are moral and religious and virtuous, and we who are live within the framework of the Constitution. We know how to do that. But everybody else, especially those that are in the elected offices, that are in the various bureaucracies, because they're not what, Tom? They're not moral, virtuous, and religious, then they don't operate within the context of the Constitution. The Constitution is a moving document because they believe to readjust it accordingly. And I got to tell you, you need to really take the constitutional classes from the Institute on the Constitution because I find that they are some of the best that I've ever facilitated. So let's kind of move around a little bit here. We could spend a lot of time on this whole thing with Kozak. He didn't pontificate fuzzy theories of how revolutionary parliamentarism might be accomplished. Nope. What he wrote was from his personal experience and intimate knowledge of how this seizure of power actually was accomplished. So he wasn't just theorizing like we have all these academics nowadays that theorize. I think, that's why I say I have no confidence in academia because they're all a bunch of, you know, pilot high and deeps blowing smoke just so that they can have, anyway, I'm not going to go down that path. And the same thing within the churches. Why in the world do you need a master's in theology? Why in the world do you need a PhD in theology or whatever it is. You have your PhD to be one of the top pastors in a pulpit. What do you need that for? You know what? If you have the scriptures, and then if you have within the earthly realm of the political concepts of constitutionalism, which are derived from the Bible, they're there, and you understand a lot of the implementation of what it means to really be a sheepdog, it's pretty important that you learn life from God's perspective and not learn from the intellectual elite who are all out there to toot their own horns. I mean, really, let's face it, the most of that, you even have that with a lot of the pundits. That's a question that somebody raised to me. I'm going to digress for a moment. I got 4 minutes or something like that. Is that I want to know if all of these major pundits that have these super podcast and TV programs and radio shows and all of that, if they are patriots, as this individual was talking to me last night uh, about, are they patriots? How do you spell that? P-A-I, triots? Or are they pay, P-A-Y, triots? Where will they really stand when the muck hits the fan? Wow, I was poetic there, Kath. How about that? Nobody's going to read my poetry. Anyway, it goes on here is that Kozak put this manual together. But you know what? We're not getting to the prophets. So the basic definition, you're going to have to go look at what I have in the references because I'm not going to spend obviously a lot of time, is that the prophets were fundamentally those that knew what was going on. They were intimately aware of all that was out of place because they were close to God. Every individual that's close to God has the capacity of calling out what is wrong, what is sinful. So instead of people and Christians being woke, pastors being woke, they're supposed to be the sheepdogs and calling out the evil, calling out the wrongdoing, calling out the other what? Pastors that are taking their people down the path of social and political sin as much as it is spiritual sin. Yeah, that's what the prophets did. I mean, you go back through every prophet and you see that yeah, they were all there as servants of God. Did they have predictive ability that God spoke to them and gave them? Absolutely, without question when it was. But for the most part, when you look at what they did, they were able to assess everything that was going on and tell the people, look, you're not following what's in God's word. What's in, the basics of the 10 commandments? What's in the, law of Deuteronomy? What are all those truths that are there? And look, here's the mirror. No, here's the word of God. And it is calling you to judgment. Guess what? In our political time right now, we need pastors and we need individuals that are people of God to first and foremost call sin, sin, call out the evil, evil, call out political leaders for not being constitutionally minded, which means they need to be what? Moral, virtuous slash religious people. They need to understand what I've talked about before is that they are under the authority of the living God of the Bible, and that is where it all starts. That's the only way we can self govern, not being individualist under the ideas and philosophies of transcendentalism. No, we need to be under the sovereignty of God. Sam Adams would. He totally understood what that meant, and he lived it as his moniker, the last Puritan, said. Come on back next week.